First story, the case of Jonathan Harris, Lighthouses of the Maine Coast, 1971. It was a quiet night, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. The lighthouse on the coast of Maine was my home, my job, my everything. I'd been a lighthouse keeper for over a decade by then, so I was used to the isolation, the rhythmic crashing of the waves and the way the beam of light cut through the darkness like a knife. But that night something was off. I can't explain it, but the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I remember stepping outside to clear my head, the cold sea breeze hitting my face, and that's when I saw it. A light in the sky. At first I thought it was a plane or maybe a satellite, but it was moving too erratically, too fast. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. The light grew brighter, almost blinding, and then it started descending toward the shore, just a few hundred yards from the lighthouse. My heart was pounding, and I felt this strange mix of curiosity and dread. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, watching this thing come closer and closer until it landed with a soft, almost silent thud. The next thing I remember is being inside some kind of room. It wasn't like any room I'd ever seen. The walls were smooth and metallic, but they seemed to glow faintly like they were alive. I don't know how I got there. One moment I was outside, staring at that light, and the next, I was here. My head was spinning, and I felt this overwhelming sense of disorientation, like I'd been pulled out of time itself. There were these beings around me. They weren't human, but they weren't exactly animals either. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, with slender bodies and skin that looked almost translucent. Their eyes were huge, black and almond-shaped, and they didn't have mouths, at least not like ours. They didn't speak, but I could feel them communicating with me, like their thoughts were pushing into my mind. I tried to move, to fight, but I was completely paralyzed. They led me to some kind of table and laid me down on it. The surface was cold, and I could feel this strange energy humming through it. That's when the pain started, sharp, invasive, like they were probing every inch of my body. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember before everything went black was one of them leaning over me, its face inches from mine, and then nothing. When I woke up, I was back at the lighthouse. The first thing I noticed was the clock. It was 4:37 a.m. I'd last checked it at around 11 p.m., which meant hours were missing. My head was throbbing, and my body felt like it had been run over by a truck. I was lying on the floor near the door, still in my coat, but my boots were off, neatly placed by the stairs like someone had taken them off for me. I tried to piece together what had happened, but my memories were fragmented, like trying to hold on to water. I remembered the light, the beings, the table, but it all felt distant, like a dream that was slipping away the harder I tried to grasp it. My hands were shaking as I got up, and I stumbled to the sink to splash water on my face. That's when I noticed the marks. Small, circular bruises on my arms and legs, and a strange raised line on the back of my neck that hadn't been there before. I felt sick to my stomach, like I'd been violated in some way I couldn't fully understand. I didn't know what to do. Who would believe me? I was a lighthouse keeper, not some conspiracy theorist. I spent the next few hours pacing, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more terrified I became. Around dawn, I decided to radio the other lighthouses along the coast. Maybe someone else had seen something. The first few responses were normal, just the usual chatter about weather and shipping traffic. But then I reached Tom, a keeper about 20 miles north of me. His voice was shaky, and he asked me if I'd seen the lights too. My blood ran cold. He described the same thing, a bright, erratic light that descended near his lighthouse. He didn't remember much after that, just a feeling of being watched and a gap in time. We both fell silent for a moment, and then he said something I'll never forget. "John, I think they're coming back." I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, staring at the radio, feeling like the world I knew had shifted somehow, like nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black, almond-shaped eyes staring back at me, and I'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat. I started noticing other things too, small, inexplicable changes around the lighthouse. The radio would crackle with static at odd hours, even though the weather was clear. The beam of light from the tower would sometimes flicker, as if something was interfering with it. And then there were the sounds. At night, I'd hear this low hum, like the vibration of a distant engine. But when I went outside to investigate, there was nothing there. It was maddening. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that the stress was getting to me. But deep down, I knew better. Something had happened to me, something real, and it wasn't over. I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail I could remember, no matter how small. The way the air smelled metallic inside that room. The way the beings moved, so fluid and precise, like they weren't bound by the same laws of physics as we are. The way their thoughts felt in my mind, cold and calculating, like they were studying me, dissecting me. I didn't know why I was writing it all down. Maybe I thought it would help me make sense of it, or maybe I just wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. About a week after the incident, I decided to go back to the spot where I'd seen the light land. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe some kind of evidence, something tangible that I could show to someone else. The area was rocky and uneven, with patches of grass and sand scattered between the stones. At first, everything looked normal. But as I walked closer to where I remembered the light touching down, I noticed something strange. The ground was scorched, but not in the way you'd expect from a fire. It was more like the grass and rocks had been bleached, turned pale and brittle, as if all the color and life had been sucked out of them. I knelt down to touch it, and the texture was wrong. It felt like ash, but it didn't crumble. It was almost spongy. And then I saw the marks. Circular indentations in the ground, arranged in a perfect pattern, like the legs of some massive machine had been planted there. My heart started racing, and I felt this overwhelming urge to run, but I forced myself to stay. I needed to see, to understand. I took out my camera and started taking pictures, but when I looked at them later, the images were blurry, distorted, like the camera couldn't capture what was really there. It was as if the place itself was resisting being documented, like it didn't want to be seen. The nights became the worst part. I'd sit in the lighthouse, staring out at the dark ocean, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. I could feel it, like a presence, pressing against the edges of my mind. Sometimes I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Other times I'd hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. But when I opened the door to listen, the sound would stop. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. Not that I thought it would do any good against whatever those things were. I just needed to feel like I had some kind of control, some way to protect myself. But the truth was, I didn't feel safe anywhere. Not in the lighthouse, not outside, not even in my own skin. I kept thinking about what Tom had said, that they were coming back. I didn't know if he meant the lights, the beings, or something else entirely. But the thought of it made my blood run cold. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying, where I was back in that room, strapped to the table, and the beings were leaning over me, their eyes boring into mine. I'd wake up gasping for air, my heart pounding, and I'd swear I could still feel their hands on me, cold and clinical, like I was nothing more than a specimen to them. One night, about 2 weeks after the first incident, it happened again. I was in the middle of my rounds, checking the equipment, when the power went out. The lighthouse went dark, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it, the low and steady, like the sound of 1,000 bees vibrating in unison. My chest tightened, and I felt this wave of dread wash over me. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the window, and there it was, the light. It was brighter this time, almost blinding, and it was hovering just above the water, maybe 100 yards from the shore. I wanted to look away, to hide, but I couldn't. It was like I was hypnotized, drawn to it in some way I couldn't explain. The light started moving toward the lighthouse, and I felt this strange pull, like it was calling to me. My legs started moving on their own, carrying me toward the door, and before I knew it, I was outside, standing on the rocks, staring up at this thing. It was massive, bigger than anything I'd ever seen, and it didn't make any sound except for that hum. I could feel the air around me crackling with energy, and my skin tingled like I was standing too close to a live wire. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen, helpless as the light enveloped me, and then everything went black. When I came to, I was back in that room. The metallic walls, the faint glow, the cold table, it was all the same. But this time, it felt different. This time I wasn't alone. There were others there, humans, strapped to tables just like mine. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I could hear them, muffled cries, whimpers, the sound of someone trying to scream through whatever force was holding them down. The beings were moving between us, their long, slender fingers working. Quickly, almost mechanically, I tried to move, to fight, but it was no use. I was completely paralyzed, just like before. One of them approached me, and I felt that same cold, invasive presence in my mind, like it was rifling through my thoughts, my memories. I tried to focus on something, anything, to keep it out, but it was too strong. It was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with my bare hands. I felt a sharp pain in my side, and I realized they were taking something, a sample, a piece of me. I wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, but I couldn't make a sound. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was one of the beings holding up a small glowing object, examining it like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. I woke up in my apartment, lying on the floor by the door. The clock said it was 3:47 a.m. But I didn't know if that was the same night or if more time had passed. My body ached, and I felt weak, like I'd been drained of something vital. I stumbled to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, and what I saw made my stomach turn. There were more marks on my body, fresh bruises, small cuts, and a new raised line on my chest. right over my heart. I felt violated in a way I couldn't put into words, like I wasn't even my own person anymore. I sat down on the floor, shaking, and tried to piece together what had happened. The others, who were they? Were they still there, trapped in that place, or had they been returned like me? I didn't know, and the thought of it made me feel sick. I knew I couldn't stay here, not after this. The apartment, the town, this whole place. It wasn't safe anymore. But where could I go? And, even if I left, would it matter? Whatever those things were, they had found me twice now. What was to stop them from finding me again? The first few weeks after leaving the lighthouse were a strange mix of relief and dread. I found a small town about 200 miles inland and rented a cheap apartment, trying to blend in and keep a low profile. I told myself I was safe here, that the distance would protect me. But the truth was, I didn't feel safe anywhere. Every night I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the hum to start, for the light to appear outside my window. I started sleeping with the lights on, not that it made any difference. The darkness always found a way in, creeping into the corners of the room, filling my mind with memories I couldn't escape. I tried to distract myself during the day, taking odd jobs and wandering the town, but it was no use. The fear was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to pull me under. I started having nightmares again, worse than before. In them, I was back in that room, strapped to the table, and the beings were leaning over me, their black eyes staring into mine. I'd wake up gasping for air, my heart pounding, and I'd swear I could still feel their hands on me, cold and clinical, like I was nothing more than a specimen to them. Then one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. The hum, low and steady, like the sound of 1,000 bees vibrating in unison. My chest tightened, and I felt this wave of dread wash over me. I sat up, my heart racing, and looked out the window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty street and the dark sky. But then I noticed it, a faint glow just above the horizon, growing brighter by the second. I wanted to look away, to hide, but I couldn't. It was like I was hypnotized, drawn to it in some way I couldn't explain. The light started moving toward the apartment, and I felt this strange pull, like it was calling to me. My legs started moving on their own, carrying me toward the door, and before I knew it, I was outside, standing in the middle of the street, staring up at this thing. It was massive, bigger than anything I'd ever seen, and it didn't make any sound except for that hum. I could feel the air around me crackling with energy, and my skin tingled like I was standing too close to a live wire. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen, helpless, as the light enveloped me, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in that room. The metallic walls, the faint glow, the cold table. It was all the same, but this time it felt different. This time I wasn't alone. There were others there, humans strapped to tables just like mine. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I could hear them. Muffled cries, whimpers, the sound of someone trying to scream through whatever force was holding them down. The beings were moving between us, their long, slender fingers working. Quickly, almost mechanically. I tried to move, to fight, but it was no use. I was completely paralyzed, just like before. One of them approached me, and I felt that same cold, invasive presence in my mind, like it was rifling through my thoughts, my memories. I tried to focus on something, anything to keep it out, but it was too strong. It was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with my bare hands. I felt a sharp pain in my side, and I realized they were taking something, a sample, a piece of me. I wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, but I couldn't make a sound. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was one of the beings holding up a small, glowing object, examining it like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. I woke up in my apartment, lying on the floor by the door. The clock said it was 3:47 a.m., but I didn't know if that was the same night or if more time had passed. My body ached, and I felt weak, like I'd been drained of something vital. I stumbled to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, and what I saw made my stomach turn. There were more marks on my body, fresh bruises, small cuts, and a new, raised line on my chest right over my heart. I felt violated in a way I couldn't put into words, like I wasn't even my own person anymore. I sat down on the floor, shaking, and tried to piece together what had happened. The others, who were they? Were they still there, trapped in that place, or had they been returned like me? I didn't know, and the thought of it made me feel sick. I knew I couldn't stay here, not after this. The apartment, the town, this whole place, it wasn't safe anymore. But where could I go? And even if I left, would it matter? Whatever those things were, they had found me twice now. What was to stop them from finding me again? The first few weeks after leaving the lighthouse were a strange mix of relief and dread. I found a small town about 200 miles inland and rented a cheap apartment, trying to blend in and keep a low profile. I told myself I was safe here, that the distance would protect me, but the truth was I didn't feel safe anywhere. Every night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the hum to start, for the light to appear outside my window. I started sleeping with the lights on, not that it made any difference. The darkness always found a way in, creeping into the corners of the room, filling my mind with memories I couldn't escape. I tried to distract myself during the day, taking odd jobs and wandering the town. But it was no use. The fear was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to pull me under. I started having nightmares again, worse than before. In them I was back in that room, strapped to the table, and the beings were leaning over me, their black eyes staring into mine. I'd wake up gasping for air, my heart pounding, and I'd swear I could still feel their hands on me, cold and clinical, like I was nothing more than a specimen to them. Then one night it happened again. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. The hum, low and steady, like the sound of 1,000 bees vibrating in unison. My chest tightened, and I felt this wave of dread wash over me. I sat up, my heart racing, and looked out the window. At first I didn't see anything, just the empty street and the dark sky. But then I noticed it. A faint glow just above the horizon, growing brighter by the second. I wanted to look away, to hide, but I couldn't. It was like I was hypnotized, drawn to it in some way I couldn't explain. The light started moving toward the apartment, and I felt this strange pull, like it was calling to me. My legs started moving on their own, carrying me toward the door, and before I knew it, I was outside, standing in the middle of the street, staring up at this thing. It was massive, bigger than anything I'd ever seen, and it didn't make any sound except for that hum. I could feel the air around me crackling with energy, and my skin tingled like I was standing too close to a live wire. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen, helpless as the light enveloped me, and then everything went black. Second story, the case of Sarah Morrison, Arcturus Lighthouse, 1984. It was 1984 and I was stationed at the Arcturus Lighthouse, a lonely outpost on a remote island off the coast of Scotland. The job was solitary, just me and the endless crash of waves against the rocks. I didn't mind the isolation. I liked the quiet, the rhythm of the sea, the way the lighthouse beam cut through the fog like a blade. But that night, everything changed. It started with a light on the horizon. Something that shouldn't have been there. At first I thought it was a ship, maybe a fishing boat off course. But the light didn't move like a ship. It hovered, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat in the dark. I grabbed my binoculars and stepped outside, the cold wind biting at my face. The light grew brighter, closer, and then it stopped, just hung there in the sky, silent and unmoving. My stomach dropped. I felt like I was being watched, like something was studying me from above. I tried to rationalize it, a weather balloon maybe, or some kind of military experiment. But deep down, I knew it wasn't anything human. I don't remember how I got inside there, whatever it was. One moment I was standing on the rocks, staring up at that light, and the next I was lying on a cold metallic table. The air smelled strange, like ozone and something else I couldn't place, sharp, almost medicinal. My body felt heavy, like I was pinned down by an invisible force. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Above me, the ceiling was smooth and featureless, glowing faintly with a bluish light. And then I saw them. They weren't like the aliens you see in movies, no green skin or bug eyes. These were different. Tall and slender, with elongated limbs and faces that seemed almost human but not quite. Their eyes were the worst part, huge, black, and depthless, like staring into a void. I could feel them in my head, like a pressure behind my eyes. They didn't speak, not with words, but I could hear them, or maybe feel them, inside my mind. It wasn't language exactly, more like images, emotions, concepts. They were curious, but not in a kind way. It was clinical, detached, like I was nothing more than a specimen to them. I tried to fight, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. All I could do was lie there as they moved around me, their long, spindly fingers brushing against my skin. The examination, if that's what it was, felt like it lasted hours, though I couldn't be sure. Time didn't seem to work the same way in that place. They didn't use tools, at least not like any I'd ever seen. Their hands just moved over me, and I could feel things happening inside my body, like they were rearranging me somehow. It didn't hurt, not exactly, but it was wrong, like my body wasn't mine anymore. I remember one of them leaning over me, its face so close I could see my own reflection in those black, glassy eyes. It didn't blink. It just stared, and I felt something cold and sharp in my mind, like it was peeling back layers of my thoughts, digging for something. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, not just by whatever force was holding me down, but by those eyes. They were endless, like staring into the void of space itself. And then, just like that, it was over. The pressure in my head lifted, and the creatures stepped back. I didn't understand what they wanted, why they'd taken me, but I could feel their satisfaction, like they'd found whatever they were looking for. The next thing I knew, I was back at the lighthouse, standing on the rocks where I'd been before. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. The light on the horizon was gone. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, a hallucination brought on by isolation and exhaustion. But my body felt off. My skin was cold, and there was a faint, tingling sensation all over, like static electricity. My clothes were disheveled, and I had a strange mark on my arm, a small circular burn that hadn't been there before. I stumbled back inside, my legs shaking, and collapsed into a chair. The lighthouse was exactly as I'd left it, the beam still rotating, the radio crackling softly in the background. But something felt different, like the air itself had changed. I glanced at the security monitors, the ones that recorded the exterior of the lighthouse. The tapes were always running, a precaution in case something happened. I rewound the footage, my hands trembling, and hit play. At first it was just the usual, waves crashing, the beam of light sweeping across the rocks. And then I saw it, a flicker of movement, something darting across the screen too fast to make out. I slowed the tape, frame by frame, and there it was, a shadow, tall and thin, standing just outside the lighthouse. The image was grainy, distorted, but I could see it clearly. And then the screen went black. The rest of the tape was corrupted, nothing but static and garbled noise. I sat there for hours, staring at the blank screen, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But there was no sense to be made. Whatever had happened, whatever those things were, they were real. And they'd been here. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black, endless eyes staring back at me. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that the stress of being alone had gotten to me. But the mark on my arm was still there, a constant reminder that something had happened. I started noticing other things too, small details that didn't add up. The clocks in the lighthouse were all running slow, even though I'd just reset them a few days before. The radio would pick up strange signals, bursts of static that sounded almost like voices, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. And then there were the dreams. Every night I'd see the same thing. The light on the horizon, the metallic table, those creatures leaning over me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, convinced they were still watching me. Didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? I was just a farolera, a nobody stationed on a remote island. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to say something. I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. So I called the mainland, spoke to my supervisor, and told him everything. He listened quietly, not interrupting, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. He said he'd send someone to check on me, but I knew what he was really thinking, that I'd cracked under the pressure, that I was seeing things. When the boat arrived a few days later, I showed them the security tapes, the corrupted footage, the mark on my arm. They took notes, asked questions, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. The isolation became unbearable after that. Every sound, every shadow made me jump. I started carrying a flashlight with me everywhere, even during the day, as if the light could keep them away. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me, that they'd left something behind, some kind of connection between us. I'd catch myself staring at the horizon for hours, waiting for the light to reappear, half terrified and half hoping it would. I didn't know what scared me more, the idea that they might come back, or the idea that they wouldn't. I tried to go about my duties, keep the lighthouse running, but my mind was elsewhere. I'd find myself standing in the middle of a room, unable to remember what I was doing or how long I'd been there. My thoughts felt scattered, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put back together. One night, about a week after the incident, I was in the control room checking the equipment when I heard a noise outside. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out onto the rocks, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first I didn't see anything, just the waves crashing against the shore, the lighthouse beam sweeping across the water. And then I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the light. My heart stopped. It was one of them. I could see its eyes, those huge black eyes, reflecting the light like glass. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, and I felt that same pressure in my head, that same cold, sharp sensation. And then, just like before, it was gone. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the spot where it had been, but when I finally went back inside, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things and left the next morning, abandoning the lighthouse, my job, everything. Leaving. The lighthouse didn't bring me the peace I thought it would. If anything, the fear followed me. I moved back to the mainland, found a small flat in a busy town where I could blend in, where the noise of people and cars might drown out the memories. But it didn't work. Every night I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for that pressure in my head to return. I started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, figures standing just outside the edge of the streetlights. I knew they weren't real, or at least I told myself they weren't, but that didn't make them any less terrifying. I stopped going out at night, stopped talking to people. I became a recluse, trapped in my own mind, haunted by something I couldn't explain. The worst part was the dreams. They weren't just dreams anymore. They felt like memories, like something those creatures had planted in my mind. I'd see myself back in that metallic room, lying on the table, their hands moving over me. I'd feel that cold, clinical curiosity again, like I was nothing more than an experiment to them. And then there were the other dreams, the ones that didn't make sense. I'd see places I'd never been, landscapes that looked alien, with skies that were the wrong color, and plants that moved on their own. I'd see other people too, people I didn't recognize, but I knew they'd been taken just like me. I'd wake up gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat, and I'd spend the rest of the night sitting by the window watching the sky, waiting for the light to appear. I tried to find answers, anything that could explain what had happened to me. I spent hours in the library, scouring books on UFOs, alien abductions, anything that might shed light on my experience. But the more I read, the more confused I became. There were so many stories, so many people who claimed to have been taken, but none of them matched what I'd been through. Some talked about being probed, about painful experiments, but that wasn't what I remembered. For me, it wasn't about pain. It was about violation, about being stripped down to nothing, like my very essence had been laid bare. I started to wonder if I'd ever really understand what had happened, if anyone could. I even thought about reaching out to other abductees, joining one of those support groups I'd read about. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? The mark on my arm never faded. If anything, it seemed to grow more pronounced, a faint circular scar that tingled whenever I touched it. I started to notice other changes too, small things at first, like how I could hear sounds from farther away, how I could see better in the dark. But then there were the bigger changes. I'd catch myself knowing things I shouldn't, like how a machine worked, or what someone was going to say before they said it. It was like my mind had been rewired, like those creatures had left something behind, some kind of imprint. I didn't know if it was a gift or a curse, but it terrified me. I felt like I was losing myself, like I was becoming something else, something not quite human. The breaking point came one night when I was walking home from the grocery store. It was late, and the streets were empty, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I was halfway down the block when I felt it, that familiar pressure in my head, like a hand squeezing my brain. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding, and looked up. There, hovering above the rooftops, was the light. It was faint at first, just a flicker, but it grew brighter as I watched, pulsing in time with the pressure in my skull. I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, like a deer in headlights, as the light descended, casting an eerie glow over the street. And then I saw them, shadows moving within the light, tall and slender, their eyes glinting like shards of obsidian. I don't know how long I stood there staring up at them, but when the light finally faded, I was on my knees, gasping for air, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold on to the grocery bag. After that night, I stopped trying to pretend everything was normal. I quit my job, sold my flat, and moved to a remote cabin in the Highlands. I needed to be away from people, away from anything that might remind me of what had happened. The cabin was old and run down, with no electricity or running water, but it was quiet, and that was all I cared about. I spent my days chopping wood, tending to a small garden, and trying to forget. But the memories were always there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for me to let my guard down. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I could. Remember about that night at the lighthouse, about the creatures, about the things they'd done to me. It was my way of trying to make sense of it all, of trying to hold on to some semblance of control. But the truth was, I didn't have control. I never had. The cabin became my sanctuary, but it also became my prison. I rarely left, only venturing into the nearest town once a month for supplies. Even then, I'd hurry back as soon as I could, my heart racing the entire time. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me, that they could find me wherever I went. I started seeing things again, shadows moving in the trees, lights flickering in the distance. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my fear get the better of me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'd heard something outside, and I'd spend hours sitting by the window staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. The worst part was the silence. In the city there was always noise, cars, people, the hum of electricity, but out here there was nothing. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional cry of a bird. It was a silence that felt alive, like it was waiting for something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me. And then, one night, it happened again. I was sitting by the fire reading an old book when I felt that familiar pressure in my head. My heart skipped a beat, and I dropped the book, my hands trembling. I knew what was coming, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring into the flames as the pressure grew stronger, more insistent. And then I heard it, a low humming sound like the vibration of 1,000 bees. I turned toward the window, and there it was, the light. It was brighter than I'd ever seen it, casting an eerie glow over the cabin. I wanted to run, to hide, but I knew it was pointless. They'd found me, just like I knew they would. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and looked up. The light was hovering just above the trees, pulsing in time with the pressure in my skull. And then I saw them, shadows moving within the light, tall and slender, their eyes glinting like shards of obsidian. I don't remember what happened after that. My memories are fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle I can't put back together. All I know is that when I woke up, I was back in the cabin, the fire long since burned out, and the mark on my arm was glowing faintly like a beacon in the dark. I don't know why they keep coming back, what they want from me, but I know I can't escape them. They're a part of me now, and no matter how far I run, no matter where I hide, they'll always find me. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, the case of Ricardo Linares, Cabo de Hornos Lighthouse, 1990. I don't know how to explain what happened, but something that still haunts me to this day happened that night. I was on duty at the Lighthouse in Cape Horn back in 1990. I was alone, like always, at the isolated post I worked at. The cold wind from the south cut right through me, and the sea was eerily still, without the usual crashing of waves. It was just me and the silence. The only light was from the lighthouse, slowly turning, cutting through that endless dark expanse. At first I thought it was a star, but I quickly realized it wasn't moving like the others. It was this green light, strange and growing, coming from somewhere far out on the water, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. I can't really explain it, but I knew it wasn't normal. I started to get uneasy, that feeling of something being wrong, but it was getting closer every second. When the light got close enough, I froze. I couldn't move. It was like my body was paralyzed, like something was controlling me, my mind. Then it happened. A flash. A blinding burst of light that blinded me instantly. The next thing I remember, I was somewhere else. My head was spinning. I could barely stand, but I was standing. I couldn't move my legs properly, like they didn't belong to me anymore. The air felt different, strange, almost suffocating. I remember the metallic scent, like something was burning or, well, I don't know how to describe it. Everything was too bright. Everything hurt. I felt like I was being pulled in all directions at once, but I couldn't see anything clearly. I could hear voices, but they weren't in any language I knew. It was like a buzzing sound, a hum that resonated deep in my bones. It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been. My body was numb, like I wasn't even in control of it. But I remember being examined. They weren't human, whatever they were. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I could feel their presence. It was as if they were inside my head, pushing thoughts in, taking them out. I don't know what they did to me, but I know I wasn't the same afterward. When I came to, I was back at the lighthouse. But something was wrong. The light from the lighthouse was still spinning, but the air felt off. It didn't have that familiar salty bite to it. The atmosphere felt thick, like I was breathing in something heavy. I looked around, and it was all the same. Nothing had changed. But I knew something had happened. Something important. Something that had taken me away from that place and brought me back. I had no idea how long had passed. The strange thing was, it didn't feel like I'd been gone for long, but when I looked at the clock inside the lighthouse, hours had gone by. I had lost time, a whole chunk of it, like someone had stolen it from me. I tried to piece together what had happened, but there were only flashes of what felt like a dream, though they weren't. They couldn't be. Those things, whatever they were, had done something to me. I could still feel them in my mind, lingering. It was like they had left something behind, something that was now a part of me, like they had marked me. It felt wrong, unsettling. I went to the mirror, checking my face, my body, anything that could give me a clue. I didn't notice anything at first, but when I pulled up my sleeve, that's when I saw it. A mark, a scar, something unnatural on my skin right above my wrist. It looked like a tiny raised bump, but it wasn't a mole or a birthmark. It was too perfect, too smooth. It was a kind of implant, like something had been embedded into me. I ran my fingers over it, but the feeling was wrong. It wasn't just skin, it was under it, like it belonged there, like it had always been there. I was frozen, staring at it. My heart started pounding again, faster this time, like I was back on that damn ship or whatever it was, with those things. That feeling, that fear, was still in me, still alive. I couldn't make sense of it. I was still dizzy, still out of it. My head felt like it was filled with static, like there was a buzzing sound in the back of my mind that wouldn't stop. I couldn't focus on anything for too long. I walked around the lighthouse, checking everything, hoping that something would make sense, that I would see something that could explain what had happened. But nothing did. The night was still. Too still. The clock on the wall kept ticking, but it sounded far away, like it didn't even belong in this place. I kept feeling like I wasn't alone. It was like someone or something was watching me, even when I knew no one else was there. I don't know how long I sat there, in that chair, just staring out the window at the sea. The waves, normally so loud and relentless, were eerily silent. There was no wind, no movement, nothing. It was like the world itself had gone still with me. And that's when I realized there was something wrong with me. I could feel it deep inside. I wasn't myself. The implant, the mark, it was them. It was a reminder, a permanent reminder of what had happened, of what they had done to me. I don't know why they chose me, but I knew one thing. They were still out there watching, waiting for me to figure it out. I wasn't free. Not really. Not ever. The hours blurred together after that. My sense of time was gone, stretched, warped. I tried to stay awake, keep my mind occupied, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the flashes of that place, the cold, sterile air, the shapes, the shadows that moved like they were part of the walls themselves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still there somewhere in that alien space. I began to think I was going mad. Maybe it was all just a hallucination, a dream, a feverish delusion brought on by the isolation, but I knew deep down it wasn't. Something had happened to me, and it wasn't normal. The feeling in my chest, that gnawing sense of dread, never left. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the green light. I heard the hum, the buzz. It was always there in the back of my mind, just beneath the surface. I didn't want to go to sleep, but I had to. It was like my body was shutting down on its own, whether I wanted it to or not. As I lay in bed, I could feel my pulse racing. I tried to tell myself it was just fear, just a panic attack from what I had seen, but I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure of anything. All I knew was that when I closed my eyes, I wasn't sure if I would wake up. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the dreams came back. It wasn't like any dream I'd ever had. It was like I was being pulled into another reality. I could feel the cold metal beneath me, the air around me growing thinner, harder to breathe. The figures surrounded me, but I couldn't see their faces, only their shapes. Tall, impossibly thin, their bodies moving in jerky, unnatural ways. Their hands reached for me, cold and mechanical. I could feel the pressure, the weight of their touch, but there was no escape. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen, just like that night. The green light flared up again, blinding me. And in that moment I realized I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't asleep. I was reliving it. I was back there in that ship with those things, and this time they were taking something from me. I couldn't remember exactly what, but I knew it was something important, something I couldn't get back. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air. My hands were shaking. I reached for the light, but it was still dark. The room was cold, but it wasn't the same cold. It felt wrong. It felt like something was still in the room with me, watching. I don't know how long I sat there, unable to move, staring at the walls, waiting for the feeling to pass. But it didn't. The fear, the unease, it stayed with me. The buzzing sound in my head wouldn't stop. Days dragged on in a haze after that. I tried to go through the motions, keep up with my duties at the lighthouse, but everything felt off. The sea, usually a constant companion, felt distant, alien. The light from the lighthouse spun endlessly, but it no longer brought me any comfort. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of that green light, the thing that had taken me, the thing that had changed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was alone. Every shadow in the corner of my eye seemed to move, like something was lurking just out of view. It was as if the air itself had become charged, like there was something in it. I didn't trust my own senses anymore. Sometimes when I looked at the horizon, I swore I could see flashes of green just like before coming from the distance. But when I looked again, it was gone, swallowed up by the night. I started to feel disconnected. My thoughts didn't flow like they used to. My mind felt clouded, as though something was blocking it, pushing against it. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew it was real. The implant, the mark on my skin, it was their doing. I could feel it now, deep inside me. A constant presence, like a small voice at the back of my mind, whispering things I couldn't understand. But whatever it was, I knew it wasn't good. Began to lose track of time again. The days blended together. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, with no memory of how I got there. I'd stumble to the window and stare out at the black sea, hoping for some kind of sign, some kind of answer. But the only thing I saw was the darkness, the silence, the vast emptiness that stretched on forever. And then, there were the nights when I would wake up and feel that presence again, right there in the room with me. I would turn around, half expecting to see something standing in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the oppressive dark. But it felt wrong. The air would get thick, heavy, like I was breathing something toxic, and my chest would tighten like I couldn't get enough air. I would hear things too, muffled sounds like whispers or clicking noises, but when I focused on them, they would disappear, and then there were the flashes. Short bursts of light, like a camera flash, that would blind me for a moment. They weren't the same as the green light from before. These were different, almost like a warning, something I couldn't understand. They would come in the middle of the night or when I was least expecting it. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape any of it. The fear had become a constant companion. I thought I was going mad, but deep down I knew the truth. I wasn't imagining it. They were still here, watching me. I started to notice something else after that. The more time passed, the more I realized I wasn't the same. It wasn't just the fear, the panic, or the nightmares. It was something deeper, something physical, like my body was changing in ways I couldn't explain. The mark on my skin, that implant, or whatever it was, seemed to be growing. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but every time I looked at it, it looked slightly different. It wasn't just a bump anymore. It had a darker color, like it was sinking deeper into my flesh. I tried to get a closer look, but it would sting if I touched it for too long, like something inside me was reacting to my fingers. I thought maybe I should leave, get away from the lighthouse, go to the city for help. But the thought of being away from the lighthouse made my skin crawl. Something told me that if I left, I'd be more vulnerable. I needed to stay. I needed to stay near the sea, near the place where they had found me. It was like they were tied to the lighthouse, tied to me. That green light, the buzzing in my head. They weren't done with me, but the worst part. It wasn't just physical anymore. I started to hear things, real things. Not the whispers or the clicking. No, this was worse. It was like I could hear thoughts. My own, but not my own. They weren't my thoughts, but they were in my head, clear as day, telling me to do things, to move, to go places. I couldn't control it. The urge would take over, and I'd find myself walking toward places I didn't want to go. My feet would move of their own accord. I had no choice. And every time, when I arrived at those places, I would find something new that didn't belong. Another reminder, another message, like they were communicating with me without saying a word. The worst of it came one night, and it happened so suddenly that I couldn't stop it. I was sitting in the small break room trying to distract myself, but the tension had been building for weeks and I couldn't escape it. That suffocating, overwhelming pressure in my chest. The implant, now deep in my skin, was aching. I could feel it throb with every beat of my heart like it was alive. I knew they were coming. I knew they were watching me, waiting. And then, without any warning, the lights flickered. The entire room went dark for a moment, and I heard the buzz again, louder than ever. It was everywhere, in my ears, in my head, in my bones. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode in my chest. And then I saw it. A flash of green. A blinding flash, so bright it made my eyes water. I couldn't see. I couldn't move, but I could feel them. They were right there, and I knew deep down that I was going to be taken again. This time, I was not going to come back. The fear that gripped me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was terror, pure terror. because I knew they were coming to do something they hadn't done before. They were going to take me somewhere far away, and I wouldn't be able to escape. The green light flared again, and this time, it wasn't just blinding. It pulled me, dragging me towards it with an unnatural force. I could feel my body leaving the ground, my feet lifting off the cold, hard floor of the lighthouse. My hands flailed, trying to grasp onto something, anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. The light surrounded me, engulfed me, and before I knew it, I was no longer in the lighthouse. I was somewhere else, somewhere not real. It was as if I had been thrown into a different dimension, a place that didn't belong in the natural world. The air was thick and metallic, like I was breathing through a filter. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed. And those figures, the ones I had seen in the flashes before, they were there, surrounding me. Their cold hands reached for me again, but this time, it felt like they were inside me. I could feel their presence in my chest, in my mind, as though they were occupying my thoughts, pulling at my very soul. I wanted to scream, to break free, but there was no sound. I couldn't escape it. I could feel them digging into my memory, my thoughts, and it was terrifying. They were taking something from me, something vital, something important. My mind was in chaos, but all I could hear was that damn buzzing growing louder, overwhelming my thoughts until I couldn't think at all. They were taking everything piece by piece until I was nothing but a shell. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The light was gone. The figures were gone. The buzzing in my head faded to silence. I was back. But when I woke up, I wasn't in the lighthouse anymore. I was back on the floor, in a place that was too familiar, yet too distant. I had been lying on the cold tiles for who knows how long. The air smelled stale, thick with a metallic scent. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't obey me. Everything was heavy, like I was waking up from a deep sleep. But my head was clearer than ever. Too clear. The memories, the experiences, everything rushed back all at once. I remembered everything, the ship, the figures, the coldness. But it wasn't just the memories. It was like they had changed something in me, something fundamental. I felt different, more aware, yet at the same time, completely empty. Like I had lost something I couldn't get back. I stumbled to the mirror, half expecting to see something different. My face was pale, and my eyes were wide, but there was nothing there to tell me what had happened. I wasn't bleeding. I didn't have any visible wounds. The mark on my wrist was still there, but that was it. There was nothing that showed what I had just been through, but I knew that something inside me had been taken. I had been changed, and it wasn't over. I spent the next few days in a daze, struggling to keep myself together. The lighthouse felt different now, as though it wasn't truly my home anymore. The walls were closing in, the air thick with an invisible pressure. I could still feel the green light on the edge of my vision, the hum buzzing in my ears, even when I wasn't consciously thinking about it. It was there, always there, and I couldn't shake the sensation that they were watching me. They, being the ones who had done this, the ones who had taken me, the ones who had left this mark on me, not just physically but mentally as well. The implant on my wrist wasn't just a foreign object. It was a reminder, a connection. I didn't know if they were still tracking me or if they were waiting for something, but I could feel their presence. It was like they were inside me. I started to keep a journal, writing down every detail, every flicker of light, every strange sound I heard, thinking maybe I could make sense of it, but it never made sense. The more I wrote, the more I felt disconnected from everything, like the very act of remembering made the experience more real, as though I had unlocked some door that should have remained closed. The fear was always there, gnawing at me. I couldn't trust anyone. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened. They'd think I was losing my mind. Or worse, they might know something I didn't. That's what terrified me the most. What if there were others who had experienced the same thing, and they were hiding it too? One night, I decided to leave. I packed a few things, prepared to walk, away from the lighthouse, away from the isolation that had become my prison. I thought that maybe, if I could just get away, go back to the city, talk to someone, get help, I could finally put all of this behind me. The thought of leaving was almost a relief. But as I stepped out onto the dock, I felt something. It wasn't a feeling of escape or freedom. It was a heavy weight pressing against me, like the very air itself was telling me to turn back. The sea was calm, too calm. The moonlight seemed to ripple across the water, casting strange shadows, almost like fingers stretching out toward me. I don't know how to describe it, but it was wrong. I couldn't go. I couldn't leave. My body froze, and that's when I saw it. A flicker of green on the horizon, the light I had seen before. It was faint, distant, but it was unmistakable. It was like it was calling to me. Without thinking, I found myself walking toward it. My feet moved on their own. I was drawn to it. And then I heard it. The buzzing. Faint but growing louder. I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't resist. I was going back. The fear, the terror, flooded back into me as I walked toward the edge of the water. I could hear the sound of waves crashing in the distance, but they didn't sound like normal waves. It was almost as if they were calling, beckoning me, and then, in the blink of an eye, the light vanished. I was alone again, but I knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. I couldn't explain what happened that night. I couldn't explain why I couldn't leave, why I was being pulled back over and over again, like something was keeping me here, keeping me in this nightmare. The days after that were like a blur. I felt like I was drifting, like I wasn't fully in control of my own body anymore. The light would come, the buzzing would start, and I would be pulled into it, into something I couldn't fight. And each time, it got harder to remember who I was, harder to remember the person I had been before. My thoughts felt fragmented, as if parts of me were being erased. I couldn't stay at the lighthouse forever, but I couldn't leave either. I was trapped. And in the back of my mind, the question gnawed at me. What were they really doing? What was their plan? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know, but I had a horrible feeling that I would never escape this. I would never be free from them. The last time I saw the green light, it was the brightest it had ever been. It filled the sky, covered the entire horizon, and for a moment I thought I was going to burn alive from the intensity of it. I was standing by the shore staring at it, paralyzed. I could hear the buzzing again, louder than ever. But this time it wasn't just in my head. I felt it vibrating through the ground, through the air. And then, just as quickly as it came, the light faded. The buzzing stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally moved, I was no longer sure of who I was. The fear, the panic, it was still there, but it had become a part of me, woven into my very being. I never went back to the lighthouse. I don't know what happened to me that night, or what they wanted, but I know I'll never forget it. It's always with me. The light, the buzzing, the implant. I don't know what happened to the time I lost or what they took from me, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never be the same again, and neither will you if you ever come across that green light. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.